What's the very first step in reducing turnover? What can your organization do today to start increasing retention? Hello, difference maker, and welcome to IDD Leader, the podcast that's all about helping IDD providers retain and grow their DSB workforce using behavioral science. I'm your host, Nate Beers, and today we're going to dive into the first steps you can take to reduce turnover. But please, let me be clear on this. I know that a very large percentage of my listeners have already taken some steps to try to reduce turnover. Chances are you've tried multiple things already. You may have added or expanded benefits. You could have started a monthly lunch with the director. Maybe you doubled your staff appreciation budget. And all of those are really good things, but they don't necessarily lead to increased retention. But what does lead to retention? Let's explore this topic together. Before we go into that, let me share this. You already know staff turnover is complex. There are macro factors, micro factors. There's a multiplicity of variables. And certainly, I can't promise, no one can promise some kind of quick fix or silver bullet. If it existed, you probably would have found it already. But what I can share with you is one of the places that I would start if I was asked to consult with your organization on how to improve staff retention. And there are steps that you can take today that will make a significant impact on reducing the turnover at your organization. It was a sunny September day years ago, but I could tell something was wrong by my boss's body language, even before he said the words, "You're getting laid off." Ugh, what a gut punch that was. I knew enough about the financial direction of this very small nonprofit that I was working at that I really had seen it coming for months. But emotionally, it still felt like a surprise, even though intellectually I kind of had seen this thing coming. And really, in those moments, I thought about trying to fight for the job. But where I landed on was I just asked if I could meet with my boss and the board just to ask questions. And he must have trusted me enough that, we had the meeting. The tone in that room is very difficult to describe. At first, I think that they were concerned and ready to try to defend the decision to cut my position. But I knew most of them personally, and throughout the meeting, I maintained a calm demeanor. I didn't feel calm on the inside, but I remained calm on the outside. And I never asked them to reconsider. But what I did do is I asked questions that I think surprised them. I had about 10-ish detailed questions about financial decisions and how the organization was responding to increasingly sinking deeper and deeper into the red. Now, I crafted the questions around curiosity, not judgment, and they were questions about facts and real numbers. Not like, well, why did you do that? Or anything, nothing along those lines, but just, do you know what happened to this? And you know, I can't remember all of them right off the top of my head, but things that were just very factual in nature. But the responses I heard, they've never left me. What I heard that day were things like, no, we don't know what happened to that pocket of money. And we're doing it the same we've always been doing it. And we trust things will work out all right in the long term. The organization was bleeding money, and this boardroom was filled with a group of people who otherwise were very good people, but they're people who were acting more foolishly than they would even realize until years later. They were, in a word, in denial. Okay, that's 2 words, but they were in denial. I don't know if it was fear. I don't know if it was pride, but they lacked curiosity on an urgent financial problem, and they simply wouldn't look it square in the face. And sure enough, within 2 years, their bank accounts were zeroed out, and what was a once growing organization just a few years prior was only a shell of its former self. And the vast majority of the people and of the resources had left by that point. Well, now turning it to our current question of first steps towards stopping turnover, let me start by being honest by saying this. When something's not going well, it's usually really painful to look at it, or at least it can be. It's easy for it to feel personal, especially if you're the executive director or HR director or in some kind of leadership role where it kind of feels like it's on you. And when we're starting to poke around or analyze what's not working, it can feel bad. But the key is this: if we just get really curious, we withhold the judgment and the accolades even of things that are going well, and we simply get curious. And as you get curious about the flow of human resources, I'm talking about people in your organization, not the Department of Human Resources. As you're curious about how people come, how they move within, how they leave your agency, so many valuable takeaways can be learned. So what's the very first step in solving the turnover problem? Get curious. But of course, I know that sounds a lot more like some kind of state of being than actual action. And I really love action. So let's break this down into 3 very actionable steps around the theme of get curious. Number 1, measure where you're currently at. This could be your current turnover stats, along with some historical statistics on that, and try to break it down in smaller units and look for any high turnover patterns. For example, you probably already know this, but most providers have way higher in turnover for the first 3 months or 6 months of new employees than they do for those that have been sticking around for a long time. One time I was working with an organization, and I was looking for different patterns in the different data that they had around turnover. And what I found was that one smaller, like a sub-program within this larger program, had comparatively outrageously high. It was more than double, almost triple the amount of turnover as the overall organization and as the rest of the organization. And so immediately I started kind of sounding the alarm saying, hey, you need to look at what's going on right in this spot. This is where we need to focus our attention and figure out what is going on. Similarly, I have also at times looked at turnover around supervisors, like the frontline supervisors, and discovered that there were a couple supervisors at one organization that had much higher turnover than the others. Now, again, I'm curious about this. I'm not immediately assuming that that's necessarily those supervisors' fault. It could be that they are supervising a house that has exceptionally difficult clients, or that they're the supervisors in a program that has other issues or challenges. Or there may be ways that that particular supervisor or supervisors are contributing. But measuring where things are currently at, looking at the statistics, the data, is hugely impactful in discovering these kinds of trends. So that's the first thing. The second thing is to do what I would call an exit analysis. Now, this certainly could involve exit interviews for those that are willing to give exit interviews. In my experience, the majority of people leaving DSP positions leave quickly and without notice, and they are not usually interested in exit interviews. Obviously, there's exceptions to that of folks that give notice, and certainly for anyone that's given like a 2 weeks notice, it's great to conduct an exit interview. But when I say exit analysis, I actually mean something more than just an exit interview. I would be trying to answer and looking at the following questions. Why did they leave? What are they leaving to go do now? Now, we may or may not have the answer to those questions, but it's worth asking and trying to figure that out. Next, are we glad that they left? Maybe they weren't actually, a great employee. And so if the answer is yes, we're glad that they left, then the question would be, 2 questions to follow that are, was it a bad hire? Like we just missed it on the hire? And secondly, did we address problems quickly? In other words, if little things were starting to crop up, did we address it, or we just let those little problems keep growing into bigger problems? And that really gets back to the culture around supervision, supervisors, and feedback in your organization. If we're not glad that they left, like, oh man, they were good staff, we didn't want to lose them, then here's some questions we can ask. Were there signs they were unhappy or needing something that we didn't give them? Another question, how was their relationship with their supervisor? And the most fundamental question is this: how did we contribute to their turnover? What could we have done, if anything, to potentially avoid it? Many research studies that I've looked at indicate that when folks are considering leaving a job or have just decided to leave a job, that they feel as though wherever they're leaving could have done things to potentially change their mind. I mean, oftentimes it's as simple as just needing a little bit more support or needing an adjustment with the culture where maybe it was too negative or things like this, things that are well within the control of an organization to fix. Anyhow, as we're conducting this exit analysis, and I recommend doing it for, let's say, 3 months of every employee that leaves, and especially every DSP, but really every employee that leaves. If we look at these questions, try to answer them as best we can, and we start to pay attention to patterns, we're likely to see things that we should address. It should become clear to us, oh my goodness, okay, we're seeing a pattern. There's a recurring theme here. This must be an area that is worth really looking at and hopefully addressing and changing for the future. The third thing, so we're looking at the stats, number 1. Number 2, we're doing an exit analysis. Number 3, take a good long look at what are we doing to incentivize DSPs to keep working here. Again, we're getting curious. Here's some things that we can pay attention to specifically. Onboarding. What are we doing to incentivize DSPs to keep working here? Well, it starts with onboarding. Actually, it starts even before onboarding. It starts in the interview process and every aspect of the hiring process. And I talk in the first episode a little bit more about the employee experience. This really matters here as well. But in our onboarding, how we set the tone will establish their expectations of us as an employer and of the job, and how things like feedback work, how much support that they're receiving as they're giving out in their role of serving the consumers that we're honored to serve. And another aspect with onboarding that becomes crucial is, were they set up for success with the training process? Now, I know there are some trainings we just need to have folks sit at a computer and click through and get done. I'm not against that at all. However, the onboarding and training needs to be a lot more than that, where they really feel as though they're welcomed onto a winning team. And we control whether or not we do that. A few moments ago, I mentioned the employee experience. And I want to revisit that here. What are we doing to incentivize DSPs to keep working here? How are we making this a winning experience for our employees and for our DSPs? This relates to how are problems handled? How are staff empowered or disempowered to succeed or not succeed in their jobs? How many healthy practices are built into daily and weekly work? Do we only hear from supervisors when there's a problem, or are they regularly touching base, regularly giving praise? There's a lot of research. I'm so sorry. There was a squirrel moment for me. Probably would be best to edit that out. There's research around that there's when staff have regular touch points with their supervisor, they perform better and they like their jobs more. The key is that touch point is that it's done properly. And so if we want to reverse engineer, employees like having touch points with their bosses. If we know this and we could reverse engineer it, where we create a fantastic employee experience around ensuring that frontline supervisors are meeting one-to-one with their direct reports, with all their DSPs, at least monthly. And that the supervisors are trained, and that they're actually, I don't mean that they sat through a training. I mean we train them until they become proficient at conducting a great supervision touchpoint meeting. That is an often underutilized tool, but having effective one-to-one touchpoint meetings with supervisors can do so much to a company's culture and to building in retention and reducing turnover. Another thing to look at under the question of how are we incentivizing DSPs to keep working here is, do we have rewards or incentives? Now, appreciation is wonderful, like all staff appreciation or things that everybody gets or drawings that everybody's entered into. By all means, if you're doing that, keep doing that. That adds fun, it adds value. But I also mean, are there things that staff can do to earn something extra? Now, you might be wondering what I mean. Well, one organization that I've worked with, they were having chronic issues with staff falling behind on their ongoing trainings. And so they just simply decided to put a small incentive, but everybody that simply stayed up to date on their trainings would get a small reward. I think it was like a little gift card or something. And it was amazing how impactful that was. Just simply, oh, if I perform well or I do this thing that's expected of me, I could get something back out of it. What's in it for me? Having a good, clear answer to what's in it for me for performing best practices is huge. Career pathing. Probably you've already heard about the NADSP, that organization that is putting out the different credentialing for DSPs. Career pathing DSP positions, and then also career pathing, trying to pull in your high potential DSPs and put them on some kind of a leadership and training track to become future supervisors. And if you've got an all-star supervisor or two, starting to invest extra in them to try to prep them to become a manager one day. These are the kinds of things that will make a huge difference when it comes to incentivizing DSPs to keep working there, because it shows folks that there's a future here. And then the last area would be pay, right? The ability to live off the wage. Now, this is tricky for all of us. We know that it's tied to state reimbursement rates, which often lag behind the current job market. And so it's tricky. I know it's tricky. What I want to say on this is that the more that you can invest any overages that you get back into staff, the more that staff will stick with you, the more there's savings with fewer vacancies, reduced overtime. It becomes this wonderful cycle of investing more into staff, getting more from staff, and saving. There's a lot of money savings that happens in that process, along with the quality of care going up and other outcomes, measurable outcomes for your agency improving. And so I think any strong organization is going to be looking at being a leader in the wage department or the wage plus benefit package department as much as possible. And it's hard for me to envision an organization whose employees are thriving if they're trying to do just simply at market value or below market value on the wages. Now, one last note I want to make is that just because we're doing something with the goal of increasing retention doesn't necessarily mean that it's working. And that's where the first thing we talked about, using data to analyze, is so powerful. We can actually assess even just a basic A/B assessment, which does not prove causation. An A/B experiment can show some correlation, but it's sure better than doing nothing, which would be to look at before we launched this, new employee benefits package, or before we added on this dollar value sign-on bonus, or before we added in, say we launch an incentive program, before and after, and just comparing, did the rate change? One time, I was working with an agency, and we had seen just like anecdotally, a number of good employees had come from referrals, like current employees referred their friends or their acquaintances, and those folks came and joined and were good employees. And so then I got really excited about this. I thought, oh, wow, well, if this is good, maybe we should really double down or triple down on those efforts to encourage our staff to refer their friends and family members. And maybe, there was already an incentive, maybe double that incentive or otherwise just really increase the efforts. But then I looked at the data, and what I found out was the retention rate for employee referred new employees versus the retention rate for just everybody else that was not employee referred was virtually the same. In fact, it was just a tiny bit higher of a turnover rate for those that were employee referred. And so then we quickly realized, well, that's probably not worth doubling down on those efforts, or at least it's not going to necessarily help with retention. It may help fill vacancies faster, and that's also valuable, but we shouldn't have a false expectation. And that simply came from looking at the facts, getting really curious and looking at the data. And if an initiative we launch is helpful, the data should prove that. And it might feel great and it might still be valuable in some other sense. But if it didn't actually move the needle, then that's really valuable information. And so I highly, highly, highly encourage you to look at the data as you're launching new initiatives, even just the before and after. And yes, it can be hard to parse it out because there's other things going on or multiple initiatives might get launched at once. But still, looking closely at it can be very, very helpful. All right. So I've covered to summarize the 3 steps. Let me say this: you want to measure where you're currently at. You want to conduct exit interviews when possible, but as part of a greater exit analysis of why people are leaving or what different things are contributing to that. And thirdly, assess what is your organization doing to incentivize DSPs to keep working there. And on a different note, I want to hear from you, difference maker. Have you ever conducted an exit analysis? And if you did, what did you find out? I'd love for you to ask me questions or leave comments so that I can share them on a future episode. Just email me at nate@iddleader.com. And then for some of you, what I'm talking about might actually be inspiring you to get serious about taking action. And you might even want to partner with someone in looking at the data or in conducting the exit analysis or determining if initiatives are successfully impacting retention. And if that's you, then I would love to set up a free 30-minute call where I can hear about what's going on at your organization and can discuss ways that I could partner with you potentially. Again, you can just reach out to me the same way. Just write me an email, nate@iddleader.com. That's NATE@iddleader.com. And I personally cannot wait to hear from you. I hope that this episode has been very helpful in identifying some immediate steps that you can take to start reducing turnover. And this is what I want to say. Until next time, here's to you, difference maker. Keep up the amazing work.